This is BBC Radio 4. It's 10 o'clock.
The World Tonight. Good evening, this is Max Easterman. The crucial Commons votes on whether to continue the process of ratifying the Maastricht Treaty are now underway. We shall be bringing you the votes as they happen and discussing the results and their implications with MPs and political commentators.
And this is Alexander MacLeod in Washington, where President-elect Bill Clinton's already committing himself to early action on putting in place the many policy initiatives he promised during his victorious run for the White House. We'll be taking a look at what those moves will be and their impact on America and the world. The news is read by Peter Donaldson.
The government's fate in tonight's vital Commons debate on Europe is being decided now as MPs file through the division lobbies. The result is still thought to be on a knife edge, despite the pressure put on potential Conservative rebels in recent days. The debate itself saw the Prime Minister spell out his personal belief in the Maastricht Treaty, while the Labour leader, John Smith, launched a broad attack on the government. Here's our political correspondent, John Pienaar.
After a day of often acrimonious debate, the whips are counting the votes, and even Tory loyalists are freely admitting that the Prime Minister's European strategy and his personal credibility may be maimed beyond recovery in the next few minutes. John Major fought as hard as he could, defending Maastricht almost line by line, and in a last, anxious message to potential Tory waverers, he appealed to MPs not to sideline Britain by rejecting the treaty he negotiated.
A centralist Europe is most likely to develop if Britain has no influence in the community, if Britain is sidelined, if we do stand aside and let others run Europe while Britain scowls in frustration on the fringes.
John Smith's performance was even more combative. He said it was wrong to press on with the Maastricht Bill, with doubts still hanging over the treaty. And he made no attempt to hide the fact that his real quarry was the Prime Minister and the government as a whole.
On these benches, we will not be conned by the government's contrivances. We will vote against a government who are undermining our society, destroying our economy, and thereby wrecking our future in Europe.
It's emerging that John Major has no intention of resigning, even if he loses the vote. But he'll know in the next few minutes whether he's facing the worst in a long line of political disasters.
In his first formal statement as President-elect of the United States, Bill Clinton has outlined a wide-ranging list of world problems which he would like to see resolved. Speaking outside the governor's mansion in Little Rock, Arkansas, he called on the international community to continue to give full cooperation to George Bush in the final 2 months of his presidency. Mr. Clinton said he had already started work on his other major task, the revival of the American economy. Our correspondent Jeremy Harris is in Little Rock.
In a statement intended to bear the full weight of his impending presidency, Governor Clinton urged friends and foes to recognize that although America's administrations changed, its fundamental interests did not. He said the greatest gesture of goodwill any nation could make towards him would be to continue its full cooperation with Mr. Bush, who remained in sole charge of foreign policy. The greatest mistake any adversary could make, he added, would be to doubt American resolve during the period of transition. Governor Clinton said he expected to work closely with the outgoing president to ensure continuity in global affairs, including the Middle East peace talks, arms control, and democracy in the former Soviet Union. The president-elect also spoke of the need for progress towards a good agreement in the world trade talks, which are currently in a state of crisis.
President Bush has returned to Washington, where he was greeted by cheering supporters on the White House lawn. Apparently unbowed by his defeat, he said the enthusiastic welcome would help him start readjusting to his new circumstances.
Let's finish this job with style. Let's get the job done. Cooperate fully with the new administration. The government goes on as well it should, and we will support the new president and give him every chance to lead this country into greater heights. And so I am very grateful to all of you. It's been a wonderful 4 years, and nobody can take that away from any of us. It's been good and strong, and I think we've really contributed something to the country, and maybe history will record it that way. Thank you all very, very much.
Negotiators from the United States have taken the first steps towards a possible trade war with the European community. The move comes after the EC blocked American attempts to impose trade tariffs on up to $1 billion worth of EC goods at a session of the GATT Council in Geneva. The two sides are embroiled in a row over the level of European oilseed production subsidies. From Brussels, Paul Legg reports.
The United States has now fired the opening shot in what's threatening to become a devastating trade war, which could wreck the chances of world economic recovery. In Geneva, American negotiators asked the GATT Council for authority to impose punitive tariffs on EC goods, totaling $1,000 million. The European community has blocked the American move, but Washington is likely to press ahead unilaterally, although it says it will allow 30 days for the measures to take effect, in the hope that a negotiated agreement can still be reached. The European Commission in Brussels has also said it doesn't want a trade war, but its chief trade negotiator, Frans Andriessen, said he would recommend member states match any American sanctions, measure for measure.
The coalition government of the Irish Republic has collapsed, making it almost certain that there'll be a general election later this month. 2 ministers from the junior coalition party, the Progressive Democrats, resigned their posts tonight, and there's to be a no-confidence vote tomorrow. Our correspondent says the government will not survive it. The election is likely to be on November the 26th.
Peter Donaldson. Well, as I speak, MPs are walking through the division lobbies in the House of Commons. They're voting in the first of tonight's 2 votes, the Labour amendment to the main government motion seeking to delay further discussion of the Maastricht Treaty until after the European Council meeting in Edinburgh next month. Our chief political correspondent, John Sargent's in the Commons. John, what's the mood down there now?
Well, it's a mixture. There are some on the government side who frankly admit that, as one of them put it, this is our darkest hour. If we can get through the next half an hour, we're okay for 4 years. So that's one way of putting it dramatically. The other side is a remarkable way in which the Commons, sometimes people rather enjoy these moments. And so you've got people who are obviously worried about the government result going up to Tories who are sitting and abstaining and giving them a friendly smile. They don't really think that. They really are desperately worried about whether the government can win. But there's still the atmosphere of the club here as well.
Is there any indication from the rebels as to what they think about the way the vote's gone?
Well, I've talked to a couple of the leading rebels and they think that they've lost. Now, one can't be sure of this. There's a game really with all these matters as to whether or not it stiffens their resolve if they think it's going to be close, or whether or not they genuinely are thinking that they've not quite got it. Certainly on the government side, there seems to be an easing of tension. They feel they have got the votes, but it's going to be very close. The figure that I'm given, and it's just purely a guess and dangerous, so close to a vote, is of a government majority on, defeating the Labour amendment of perhaps 5. But that is a guess. We simply don't know, and there's no doubt that this is still wide open.
And very briefly, John, what sort of a debate has it been? Has it been cool? Has it been animated? What's the tone?
Well, it's been not very exciting for the simple reason that the arguments are well known and that what really people are interested in is the result. So I'm afraid it's not been one of those great Commons occasions where people are swayed by the speeches that are made. People are much more interested in, will one or other of the waverers just simply tip over on the government side.
John Sargent will be back with you when the results are announced in a few minutes. For the moment, thank you.
The first 100 days in any new U.S. presidency are traditionally a time of determined and urgent action. Bill Clinton made it clear just an hour or so ago that the hectic pace of his campaign will be matched by his bid to honor his many pledges.
To the people of our great nation, for whom we pledge to get up every morning and work hard to bring the economic opportunity that was at the core of the Clinton-Gore campaign, I say that the task has already begun. It will not be easy, but we will spare no effort to restore growth, jobs, and incomes to the American people.
But how easy or how hard will it be for America's 42nd president to make the policy impact he wants after 12 years of Reagan and Bush? Who will the characters be who populate his administration and who will be expected to energize its domestic and foreign policies? I'm now joined in our Washington studio by 2 distinguished political analysts, neither of them strangers to the world tonight. Daniel Shaw is chief commentator for American Public Radio. Fred Barnes is a senior editor of the magazine New Republic. Dan Shaw, the Clinton campaign was on the basis of the need for change. What are some of the early changes we're going to see?
Well, I think some of them have been indicated in the excerpt that you played from President-elect Clinton. He says he wants to go very quickly with a new plan for investment to create jobs. Jobs are clearly the #1 priority for him. Close to that is introducing a new system for national health insurance that has some combination of government government working with industry to do it, industry doing it, if not the government will. And then thirdly, simply going through the whole list of the whole social structure of America and seeing where welfare payments and others can be reformed to become more effective.
Fred Barnes, in economic terms, he can't really achieve much in those first 100 days, can he? I noticed he promised, for example, to put in place a new medical system. That's too tight a program.
Well, it's certainly not going to happen. He'll be lucky to have it happen in 4 years. It really does take a long time, and it is an issue that divides Democrats in Congress. They failed to get a majority in the House of Representatives earlier this year on a simple health care package. They couldn't do it. The division is still there between the Southern conservatives and the Northerners, and it is going to be very difficult for Bill Clinton to broker that. It's going to take him a lot more than 100 days.
Dan Shaw, can Mr. Clinton do the two things he promised, help millions of unemployed Americans and at the same time reduce the federal budget deficit?
Well, he says he can. I mean, obviously, the two have to be played and have to be synchronized in a very, very careful way, because if he tries to reduce the deficit first, he may be contributing further to recession and unemployment. On the other hand, if he goes too far towards very quick investment, he increases the deficit and makes that problem worse. He claims, however, and we'll see if he can do it, he claims that by very carefully fine-tuning these two programs at the same time, he can, within a reasonably short time, create enough new revenues springing from new investment and new jobs in themselves to help to reduce the deficit. We'll see if he can.
Fred Barnes, is there enough ground for him to straddle on both feet on those two issues?
No, I don't really think so, and he's going to have to let the deficit be a secondary issue. The first thing he wants to do is speed up the spending on infrastructure, namely roads, bridges, rapid rail. That will get more money into the economy, it will provide more jobs, and he's going to have to worry about the deficit later. But there's a problem by not worrying about the deficit. Financial markets react very unfavorably, including international financial markets. And of course, John Major in England has found out what happens when they react in a way it can harm the American economy.
In terms of personnel, Dan Shaw, who's likely to become the economic guru of this administration, either in the cabinet or elsewhere in the administration?
I don't want to predict, because we know who his advisors are who've been working with him, and something tells me that these people will not necessarily be the ones. But there are people like Professor Bob Reich, for example, at Harvard University, who has been very influential both in devising and in articulating his policy. But I think playing games with names right now is not productive. Fred is closer and may know better.
Well, I don't mind playing games with names, because Bill Clinton's going to have to come up with one very quickly, a new Treasury Secretary or Finance Minister. For him, it's the most important, urgent appointment, because it is the one that will soothe financial markets, which get upset when a Democrat comes into power. And the names that are being mentioned are Senator Lloyd Bentsen, a conservative Texas Democrat, and Paul Volcker, who was formerly the head of the Federal Reserve Board and who has had some conferences with Bill Clinton in recent weeks.
Dan, how much activism is there going to be on the economic front? I mean, he says that trickle-down didn't work, but there must be limits to what he can spend on infrastructure and that type of thing.
Well, yes, it's not only a question of spending, it's also a question of regulation. It's also a question of the government putting its hands on the economy. The whole past 12 years have been devoted largely to deregulation, laissez-faire, let the economy try to run itself. I believe that President-elect Clinton has taken his mandate as being a mandate for a more activist government, to go back to the older democratic days with Roosevelt and Johnson and have the government do more. There'll be more spending, but I think spending is not the only thing that there'll be more. You will see the government giving regulations to the states, giving regulations to industry. The health plan, for example, depends on a certain amount of government regulation, and that's where we'll see them back in the business of governing again.
Do you expect that degree of interventionism, Fred?
I'm not sure whether there's going to be that much. He's going to have to raise some revenue to pay for it. His numbers don't work, and he really doesn't have much of a mandate for anything. He got 43% of the vote, certainly not a majority. The real desire on the part of the voters was for George Bush to leave. They weren't really anti-Republican or anti-incumbent, but they wanted Bush to leave. Whatever Clinton does had better work, because then the voters will be happy with it. They're not asking for anything in particular, but just success.
We've forgotten, Dan Shaw, all about the Republicans? Is there going to be an awful fight for the succession after George Bush? Very quickly, please.
Quite undoubtedly. I think there'll be a lot of blame laying all around, and I think that we'll see a great resurgence of the religious right trying to take control of the Republican Party.
Fred Barnes?
I think the bigger fight is going to be one among the Democrats, with Democrats in Congress wanting to spend a great deal more money than Bill Clinton, now as president, is going to want to go along with.
I've been talking to Fred Barnes and Dan Shaw. Now back to London.
And we're only seconds, at the very least, minutes at the very most, away now from the result in the first motion, the Labour amendment to the paving motion for the Maastricht Treaty. Let's join John Sargent again in our commentary box in the House of Commons. John, what are the indications now?
Well, we don't know the result yet, but any moment it's going to come. The House is packed, everyone's expectant. At any moment, we're going to see the tellers come through and we're going to get this first vote. Now, the first vote is on the Labour amendment, and this is broadly the one which says that they shouldn't consider the bill until after the Edinburgh summit. And the Edinburgh summit is where they're going to take decisions on subsidiarity, and they're going to take decisions on what to do about the Danes. So now it looks as if, I've seen the Chief Whip now coming back into the chamber, and he's smiling, which may or may not be a sign. He looks as if he... certain amount of confidence there. Yes, I've heard one of the Tory whips has said to the Prime Minister, we've won. And he's giving him what the result is. So it looks as if the government have beaten off the Labour amendment. But we're waiting to see what the result is.
Of course, that means,
we're
John...
now seeing...
That means, John, even so, that there's still the main motion to be voted on in about a quarter of an hour's time.
That's right, but of course the first one is the one that the rebels were hoping that they would win, because that would give them the momentum to them. It would also avoid the danger of some of the Labour pro-Europeans drifting away and not taking part in the main vote. So I think this first vote is going to be critical. Now, we've seen all the rumours, we've seen the little smiles, we've seen the discussions, but we've still not got the result. We've got the tellers still putting... Yes, now we're getting it now. They're just writing down the results to the clerk, and it looks as if they're going to now line up. Here we are. And the government side cheering, and of course it means the government on the right, which means the government have won. So let's hear it now.
Order. The ayes to the right, 313. The noes to the left, 319.
The government have won by 6. And there are waving of order papers, government pleased, and Labour pointing at the Liberal Democrats, bitterly critical. They knew it was going to happen, and now they're deliberately pointing the Jacques Hughes fingers at the Liberal Democrats. Paddy Ashdown sitting there, smiling, pretending not to be upset. And we're now going off to vote on the main motion now, and the House is about to divide again, but tremendous relief on the government side. Chief Whip smiling to Michael Heseltine, and the Prime Minister looking around, looking back at his supporters, knowing that in fact it looks as if he's won, but we've still got the second vote.
John Sargent, thanks very much. We'll be coming back to you for that second vote in about 10 minutes' time, but now I'm joined in the studio here by Simon Heffer, Deputy Editor of The Spectator, and in our Westminster studio by Donald McIntyre, the diplomatic editor of the political editor, sorry, of The Independent on Sunday. Simon, we heard John earlier saying that one member of the government had said to him, win this vote and we're all right for 4 years. What do you make of that?
I think that's rather optimistic. Mr Major will no doubt be relieved that he's won, albeit by a very small majority provided by the Liberal Party, this vote on the Labour amendment. But within a few weeks there'll have to be a vote on the revenue raising by the council tax, which is going to hit a lot of Tory constituencies very hard. And that's just one of the very close votes that's going to come up for this government in the next few months. There's also bound to be some pressure on some of the public spending decisions that are going to be made, like the freezing of public sector pay. And of course the pit closures issue has got to come back and be formally sorted out in the House of Commons after Christmas. So to say that this sets them up for 4 years is, I think, rather looking on the bright side.
Donald McIntyre, do you think that John Major's reputation has been preserved or even possibly dented in spite of the fact that he's won the vote?
No, I mean, I think that we were all getting ready to say that this would be a terrible defeat for John Major's leadership of the Tory party if he had lost. The fact is, albeit by a very small majority, he's won, and I don't think we should underestimate the degree of euphoria there's going to be in government circles about this. I think it is going to restore a lot of confidence to the leadership. I agree with Simon that there are some tremendous problems ahead, but the fact remains that this was, as it were, the flagship of John Major's post-election policy. He's won a very important vote on it. He's going to have to box extremely clever through some very, very difficult waters, to mix my metaphors horribly, in the next few months. But this is the one that counted, and I think the leadership will take quite a lot of confidence from this.
Do you, what do you make also of the situation for Labour now? How is their credibility going to hold up? Their European credentials must surely be somewhat tarnished by having lost this amendment, by having brought it in the first place.
Well, I think they've paid a fairly heavy price in terms of their credibility, and of course the government have lost no time in making that point. I mean, I think that there is one point that we still have to remember, however, which is the real question remains how the Labour Party are going to behave during the committee stage of the Maastricht Bill, assuming that we get to one, and in the third reading. And my betting is that John Smiths is pretty determined at present to do exactly what they did in the second reading and abstain. And of course, one paradoxical upside for the pro-Europeans in the Labour Party about today's vote is that their hand will rather be strengthened now. They will say, look, we tried this technique of opposing the government outright, and actually we didn't win. Therefore, we'd better go back to where we believe we are located now as a party, abstain, and allow the government to get through its Maastricht Bill.
Simon Heffer, if I can come back to you for a moment. Now, one of the things which Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Secretary, said in his closing speech was that people had been reacting to this motion as if there were long passages written into it in invisible ink. I think a lot of people believe that's precisely the case, don't they?
Well, yes, we had the suggestion yesterday that the author using this invisible ink was, among others, Mr. Bangerman. And there's been a constant debate in the Tory party, and indeed in the Labour Party, which Brian Gould has personified, that the Maastricht Treaty itself contains an explicit agenda which hasn't been properly explained to the people in this country. It was explained to the Danes, and they rejected it. It was explained to the French, and they almost rejected it. And there's as you know, going to be a review, a further review starting in 1995 under the treaty when it's enacted. So this is but the first step in a rolling process of moving to ever closer union. And I think there are a lot of people in the Tory party who are concerned that when the Prime Minister says, I am the most Eurosceptical member of the Cabinet, and all I want to do is to put Britain at the heart of Europe, that the price for putting Britain at the heart of Europe and for having the influence which Mr. Hurd talked about and Mr. Major talked about today in the debate is a very high price indeed, and it is a price that is broadly, as Mr. Bangerman said yesterday, federalist.
Donald McIntyre, do you believe that when the committee stage gets underway, that this explicit agenda of Maastricht is going to be made more public, and that this, in fact, may create as many problems as it solves?
Well, I think there are two things about this. First of all, it's perfectly true that as the detail of the Maastricht Treaty is exposed, put under very close scrutiny as it will be in the committee stage, obviously some people in the country, and I guess some people in Parliament, will wake up to things that they find in the treaty which they had not really been conscious of, which they find objectionable. That's certainly true. On the other hand, I think the real significance of today's vote, as one leading member of the rebels said to me tonight, this is really the big one. People will say that when we get to the third reading, we'll vote against it, but quite honestly, I don't think we can bank on that. There are people who are saying that to comfort themselves for having buckled today, but actually, I think this has been a very important watershed in the progress of the Maastricht Treaty.
Is it clear that when we get to the committee stage, that this will in any way be got through in time to ratify the treaty so that, in principle, the Maastricht Treaty can go ahead next year? It's supposed, after all, to be ratified by the 1st of January, isn't it?
Well, I don't think there's any question that it's going to be ratified by the 1st of January. I think that what will happen is that the government will very cautiously and tentatively bring back the bill, probably sometime in late November. There will be a couple of token sittings. They won't, as John Major made clear in his speech today, discuss the detailed issues of subsidiarity, and then it will come back after the Edinburgh Summit and after Christmas. And I think it's not possible at the moment to say how how long that will take, but I mean, we could be at least until spring before a third reading.
Donald McIntyre, thanks very much. Simon Heffer, Donald McIntyre will be coming back to you shortly, but for the moment, let's just take up the question of the controversial EC Commissioner Martin Bangerman, who chose yesterday to make a speech declaring that the Maastricht Treaty, was a milestone on the road to a federal Europe. John Major was quick to condemn those remarks as being silly and ill-informed. And today, Chancellor Kohl stepped to the Prime Minister's defence, but not before Eurosceptics had seized on the Commissioner's remarks, claiming that they revealed the true intentions behind the plans for closer European Union. So just who is out of step with whom, Herr Bangerman or Mr Major? Janet Cohen reports.
Herr Martin Bangerman is not renowned for his timing. It isn't the first occasion his remarks have caused embarrassment in Brussels. Only last month he bitterly attacked those trying to slow down the Maastricht process, saying there was no safe haven in a return to national identities. This far from faceless bureaucrat is also known as the enemy of the British sausage and the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp. I asked Dr. Angelika Woller of the German Society for Foreign Affairs if he's right about the inherent federalism of the Maastricht Treaty.
I wouldn't agree at all, because it doesn't mention the word federalist, of course at British insistence, and I think it is really about an ever closer union. And I think if the Germans understand more federalism by this, that's all right. If the British don't, that's all right as well, as long as it is an ever closer union.
Could the ever closer union end up as a federalist state, do you think?
Well, I don't know, you see, because I have a feeling that Herr Bangerman interprets it as the German way of federalism, and he seems to think that that's the utmost of all things to be achieved. Well, I'm not so sure about it, because, for example, in our federalist state, it is extremely difficult for a young teacher to actually move between Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia, and that is because of federalism, so that is not so good, and I don't think what does not work so well in Germany should not be achieved in Europe.
The principle of subsidiarity enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty has been promoted as a step away from federalism, limiting community-wide action, allowing important decisions to be made nationally and even regionally. Herr Bangerman has said that subsidiarity can only be guaranteed in a federal system. Xavier de Villepin, a member of the French Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, says he's wrong.
Mr. Major is right, because it is not at all what it is in the treaty. If you accept the single currency, I think we are in the stage all together in a cooperation between the different European governments, which is difficult, sometimes inefficient, but we are not on a federal way.
But the definition of federalism is open to interpretation. Dr. Gianni Bonvicini is director of the Italian Institute of International Affairs. He believes Herr Bangerman is right.
The Maastricht Treaty in itself is a treaty which at the very end of a longer way foresees, in fact, a kind of federal system. The fact that the Maastricht Treaty provides the basis for a common single European currency is in itself an element, a factor, very much important factor, having in mind to build up a federal system.
To the Danes, the whole issue is cloudier. Per Knudsen is deputy editor of the newspaper Information, which came out against Maastricht. He believes that there's so much open to interpretation that it's impossible to say if the treaty is federalist or not.
You have to remember that the Maastricht Treaty was a compromise, somebody would say a mess. That's why it's so difficult to make sense of the present debate, and that's why you have this gulf between the people and the political establishment in Europe, as you've seen in France and Denmark and in Britain. The fact is that the Maastricht Treaty is a skeleton without flesh and bone. Only the years ahead will tell what creature we'll end up with. And of course, if you ask a member of the EC Commission, Mr. Bangerman, he will give you a federal interpretation of the treaty. And if you ask a head of government, Chancellor Kohl, he will give you a non-federal interpretation.
And Dr. Angelika Woller agrees that there'll always be a tension between Eurocrats who want to fast-track Europe and politicians who pull back. Meanwhile, she argues, it would be better for Mr. Major to stress what he won at Maastricht rather than stand up in front of backbenchers calling himself a Eurosceptic.
I'm sorry about him saying he's a Eurosceptic. He's not a federalist, we all know, but that he's a Eurosceptic I find very sad. If that was the spirit in which he signed Maastricht, I think it was the wrong spirit. He is actually the one who shaped the Maastricht Treaty according to the British views, and I personally would interpret Maastricht in a very restrictive way.
Angelika Foller of the German Foreign Affairs Institute. That report from Janet Cohen. The vote on the second vote in the Commons is due any time now. This is on the main government motion that the the third reading in committee stage should proceed on the Maastricht Bill. We're joining John Sargent again in the Commons now. John, the Labour amendment was lost by 6 votes. What's the expectation of the government motion?
Well, the expectation is the government will now get their motion, and the signs are they have got that majority, but we still don't know, and there's a certain amount of movement on the floor, but it's also a much more relaxed House of Commons. There is a feeling that first vote was the critical vote. The government had a majority of 6, and a sort of wave of relief swept across the government benches with the Prime Minister looking around and everyone smiling. Now, they're having another go at this, and we're getting... Tristan Garrell-Jones, the Foreign Office Minister, is talking to the Chief Whip now and excited, and I think it looks an optimistic way from his point of view. So we should get the result fairly soon. And as I say, there's a feeling of relief on the government side.
The feeling generally then that the Prime Minister and the government are off the hook.
That's right. I mean, yes, and Richard Ryder has just slapped on the shoulder one of his whips, a sure sign that, in fact, they've got it. The Chief Whip, Richard Ryder, smiling now, and the government bench is smiling, looking around, they're pleased. And the tellers are now coming into place. And we can see them now. Yes, they're all the government is smiling because they're shouting now, waving their order papers, because they can see from the way the tellers are lined up that the government have won. They've won this incredibly critical vote for them. Now let's hear the result.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 316.
So there we are, by 3 votes. By just 3 votes, the Tories are thrilled to bits, waving their order papers. 3 is enough. 1 before the vote said to me 1 would be enough. And again, Labour MPs pointing at the Liberal Democrats with their fingers, the fingers of Jacques Hughes. They're the traitors on the opposition side, as Labour would see it. Pointing and gesticulating, Paddy Ashton looking grim-faced ahead of him. And most of the Liberal Democrats, all of them now, just sitting there. Simon Hughes smiling, but obviously that's the tension on the opposition side. On the government side, an enormous feeling of relief.
John Sargent, many thanks indeed. We'll perhaps talk to you a bit later in the programme. I'm joined now, though, by Peter Temple-Morris, Conservative MP in our Westminster studio. Mr Temple-Morris, I imagine, A, you're relieved, and B, you're happy that you can go ahead with the main committee stage now of the bill.
Well, extremely happy, thank goodness, and very relieved. It's been a very tense evening, not to mention a very tense run-up. The main thing now is that we have no confidence motion. We have the Prime Minister confirmed, as it were, having taken this risk and having run through it, and it was a very considerable risk that he has taken. I think he will draw strength from this. So we're now on with Maastricht. We're not out of Europe. He can do a good Edinburgh summit, and indeed the government proceeds.
But don't you feel that in some way the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, must be somewhat weakened by the fact that they held a debate they didn't need to hold, that they unnecessarily stirred things up?
Well, we could easily have chickened out, if that's the right phrase, by having an adjournment motion of the House and therefore not having any effective vote at all. Or if it had been a vote, it would have been a confidence vote. As it was, John Major faced this one. He faced it not quite knowing, and indeed nobody knew in there until those votes were declared exactly which way people would go. So he faced it, he got through. Now, it's up to him, I think, to draw strength from that and no more, if I may say so, little local difficulties. We press on now with government policy, we put the economy right, and obviously we get on with Edinburgh.
Do you perhaps not fear, though, that at the end of the committee stage, when the bill comes back for third reading, that the rebels will feel that they've really got to pull their weight absolutely the next time? If Labour decide that they're not going to abstain, the whole bill could fall.
Well, I think what one mustn't forget about that is that one talks about the rebels all the time, the very, in fact, comparatively small minority. You forget the rest rest of us, the majority. And indeed, I think we'll be pulling our weight even more now because we can go into the committee stage with confidence. And indeed, as necessary, we will debate, we will fight, and we will vote. So this bill is now going ahead. That's very important. And don't forget the majority that voted for it.
Peter Temple-Morris, thank you very much indeed. Simon Heffer with me here in the studio. There have been, as we've just heard from John Sargent, fingers pointed accusingly at the Liberal Democrats. Now, how is this going to affect them?
Well, Mr. Ashdown has stuck to his principles. He made no secret in the Liberal manifesto in April that the party was a federalist party. And indeed, everything Mr. Bangaman said yesterday about what he thought was the hidden agenda of the Maastricht Treaty would have been music to Mr. Ashdown's ears, because that's what he basically wants, and his party have made no secret of that. However, don't forget Mr. Ashdown got up in Hyde Park 10 days ago and complained about the treatment dished out to the miners by this government. And no doubt he'll be complaining in the next few days about the public spending cuts and the treatment handed out to nurses, teachers and others who may well have their pay frozen. And I know from talking to Liberal MPs today that they've had letters from activists complaining about Mr. Ashdown's stance in a ratio of 9-1 against those who have been supporting him. There is a great feeling among Liberal activists, and Liberal MPs are the first to say this, that Mr. Ashdown had a chance to humiliate the Prime Minister this evening, and as a leader of an opposition party, he had a duty to take that. Now, he decided to stick to his principles, and one can't criticise him for that, but he had another wider political judgment to make about whether he wanted to destabilise this government and perhaps precipitate not an election on this issue, because that was quite clearly not going to happen, but perhaps bring an election eventually closer if the party had been destabilised in the long term. And he decided to pass that chance up. Now, I suspect in the next few days, Liberal MPs will go back to their constituencies and they will get a view, again from their activists, on whether they did the right thing. I suspect, given there has been such an avalanche of mail against what the Liberals have done, that feeling won't go away, and that Mr. Ashdown may have some damage he has to repair in the country.
Donald McIntyre, if I could bring you back into this discussion, Donald McIntyre, The Independent on Sunday. Where does the Labour Party go from here? They've been trounced twice. What have they got to do now?
Well, one thing they've got to do, as we were discussing earlier, is to sort out their policy on Europe. And I think, as we were also saying, that it's more likely now that John Smith will get his way and secure a policy of abstaining in the third reading rather than voting against it, especially in view of today's result. I think the other thing that John Smith probably has to do is to show those people in his party who are a little disappointed, and I think they're across quite a broad spectrum of the party, that he hasn't really quite fulfilled the expectations. There's no doubt, I think, that the Prime Minister has proved a more effective parliamentary performer than he was when he started. He made quite an effective speech today. John Smith is a brilliant debater in the House of Commons, but I think there's a feeling among a lot of people in his own party that he hasn't really scored any hits yet, any big hits. And I think he's going to have to convince the party, as well as the country at large, that he can do so. And some of the things that Simon Heffer was talking about earlier, the very difficult time the government's going to have over public spending, the great problems over the council tax, are certainly going to provide no shortage of opportunities for him to do so. But I think the party are looking to him now to make a more effective form of opposition against the government.
Doesn't he also have the potential problem of a split in his own ranks? Because once the debate within the Labour Party on Maastricht really begins, it hasn't yet, the Europhobes and the Eurosceptics in the Labour Party are going to start shouting and stamping their feet as well, are they not?
Well, there's no doubt that they will do that. There are some prominent members of the shadow cabinet, for example, though I would say probably still a minority. There are a lot of people on the left of the party generally who actually are Eurosceptic anyway and believe that it would be useful to oppose the government on that subject. And there is going to be a battle over this in the Labour Party. But I think that John Smith has two great strengths. The first is, as has been amply demonstrated in today's debate, he knows that he will risk the charge of completely abandoning the party's pro-European policy if he proposes really voting against the government in the third reading. And the other point is that there is a potential for a rebellion by pro-Europeans in Labour ranks. Even if Labour were to oppose the Maastricht Bill in the third reading, the chances are that anything from 12 to 25 Labour MPs, including some pretty prominent ones like Giles Radici and Roy Hattersley, might simply ignore the whip and vote with the government. That would mean that Labour would, first of all, be opposing, running the risk of losing its credibility, and secondly, not even delivering a victory over the government. And that would be a very bad position for the Labour Party to be in.
Right, thanks very much. Now, we're joined from the radio car by Nick Budgeon. Mr. Budgeon, the teeth have been drawn, haven't they, on this one?
Well, I don't know. I think you might well find that in 6 months' time, the government was sad that it wasn't defeated tonight. I think we're going to see a rerun of the situation that occurred with the devolution legislation at the end of the 70s. I think there isn't a true majority for this in the House of Commons, and I think that you will find that many of the very heavily whipped people who supported the government for one reason or another tonight will break ranks as the committee stage is slowly considered in the House.
But what happened to your much vaunted solidarity amongst the rebels? Why was it that on what effectively was the best way of showing displeasure without actually damaging the government terminally, so many people melted away into the night?
Well, I mean, I think, as I say, that it was a very, very heavily whipped occasion. And I think there's plenty of evidence that the whips did things like ringing up constituency chairman and making all sorts of threats against members of Parliament. And I think that...
You make this sound like Tammany Hall, Mr. Budgeon.
Well, I don't know. I haven't any great experience of Tammany Hall, but I was once a whip, and I know how these things are done, and I know what was done in relation to my chairman. And I mean, very considerable pressures are exerted.
Is it not, in a way, a blessing that this has happened the way it has? Because we're faced now, are we not, with the prospect of United States trade sanctions in agriculture against us. Surely the European community at the moment needs unity. It needs the Maastricht Treaty on the statute book as soon as possible so that it can deal with these attacks.
I don't think that the Maastricht Treaty is necessary for any of the things that you mention. And the Maastricht Treaty is not going to get on the statute book quickly. I mean, one thing that all this constitutionally unnecessary excitement has done is that it's elicited from the Prime Minister a very clear undertaking that the committee stage will be carried out very slowly.
Nick Budgeon, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Also in the radio car, Dr. Jack Cunningham, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Dr. Cunningham, I'd like to put to you a point that Sir Edward Heath, made in the debate, that he had waited 40 years for a Labour leader who truly supported Europe, and that Labour leader has now forsworn his integrity. He did, didn't he? Hello, Dr. Cunningham?
Yes, hello.
Sorry, you obviously didn't hear my question.
No, I did not.
I would like to put to you the point that Edward Heath made in the debate. He said that he'd waited 40 years for a Labour leader who truly supported Europe, and that Labour leader, John Smith, had now forsworn his integrity. That's true, isn't it?
No, it's completely untrue, and also what Ted Heath said about leaders in European parties is untrue. I've had the advantage of being in Europe recently and talking to leaders of socialist parties, certainly, and they fully understand our position and were supportive of what we were doing.
Well, the Euro-socialists don't constitute a majority in Europe. There are a lot of other people.
Well, they constitute a majority in the European Parliament, of course, because it is the biggest group in the European Parliament. So you're quite wrong to suggest that.
I take that point.
We do have some socialist governments in Europe too. So we're pretty well represented there. You know, of course, I wouldn't claim for a moment that Euro-conservatives support the British Labour Party in this or in anything else. I wouldn't expect them to.
Do you not have to face now the possibility of a quite damaging debate within your own party about Maastricht, because you have got as many potential rebels on the left of the party who do not want to see the Maastricht Treaty ratified as Mr. Major has in the Tory party?
Well, two things are clear. First of all, the Labour Party was completely united tonight in the lobbies, as all my colleagues made clear in their speeches, and the Conservative government has only survived because Paddy Ashdown and the Liberal Party supported them. That must be a very uncomfortable position, both for Mr. Major and for Mr. Ashdown. And when cuts in public expenditure come along, people will remember why this government is still in office with any credibility. It's because of Liberal support. As for the debate in the Labour Party, you're quite right, of course. We do have some implacable opponents of European community membership in general, and Maastricht in particular, in Labour's ranks. But our conference at Blackpool in September and early October voted by overwhelming majorities in favour of support for the Maastricht process. Of course, we don't agree with the government's Maastricht bill because it leaves out the social chapter. But nevertheless, that is the party's position in policy terms. It's one that John Smith and I will uphold.
Dr. Cunningham, thank you very much indeed. That was Dr. Jack Cunningham, Shadow Foreign Secretary. And we're joined now by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashdown, the man at whom the finger was pointed after both the vote by the Labour Party. Mr. Ashdown, are you there? I know you have to get into the seat in the radio car. Can you hear me?
I've got you.
Good. Now, you have been accused by the Labour Party of keeping the government in power. You're tarred with that loss of credibility.
Well, that's a deliberate deceit, not to say, and I won't mince my words, a dishonesty that the Labour Party has been trying to perpetuate right throughout this debate and before it, because everybody knows that this debate was not about the future of the government. The government could not have fallen on this debate. That would only have happened after a motion of confidence, which they would clearly have won. And that would have been taken tomorrow. No, what we've done here is we've made certain that Britain does face up to this key decision, uncertainty over which is costing our capacity to get out of this deep, deep recession. The effect of tonight is that the inward investment that Britain needs so desperately will not stop, which was what would have happened if the Maastricht process had been stopped or delayed as Labour wanted. The outcome of that is that tens of thousands of jobs across this country will not be lost, and this country will have a better chance of getting out of the recession. What Labour were doing tonight was playing a short-term game of Westminster party politics for which people would have had to pay with their jobs in times to come. And I am delighted and proud that we have done a night's work which has stood up for our principles, not abandoned them as Labour has done, and which has saved tens of thousands of jobs across Britain.
It is true, though, isn't it, that you and your colleagues have received quite a large amount of mail criticising the stance you've taken. Now, how are you going to square your principles with your activists?
Well, let me say two things to you. It is never easy to do what is right in politics, and it is never right, or very rarely right, to do what is easy. Standing by your principles and putting the nation's interest rather than Westminster game for one Wednesday night first, and saving jobs and creating the conditions in which this country's future is assured in Europe is what I believe this country wants from a political party. Voting in November against what you asked people to vote for in April, which is what the Labour Party did today, shows a depressing lack of ability to stand by your own principles. And I won't involve myself in that, and neither will my party. And I'm certain that when this country comes to vote again, they want a political party they can trust to stand by what they say, not one that does a U-turn and sacrifices jobs for a little short-term benefit.
Paddy Ashdown, leader of the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much indeed for joining us from our radio car at Westminster. Well, now we go back to the House itself, and John Sargent, our chief political correspondent. John, I gather you've had a chance to have a word with the Prime Minister.
Yes, just very briefly. He came out of the chamber across to the lobby on his way to the Whip's office to congratulate those who managed to get this triumph for the government, and I think it is a triumph. I think that, as one cabinet minister put it to me, if you win easily, that's one thing, but to win when it's as close as this, well, he said that is a triumph. The feeling of relief cannot be overstated on the government side. There is a feeling that, all right, it may have been 3 votes, but 1 would have been enough, but it may change the course of history.
John Sargent, thanks very much indeed. Simon Heffer with me here in the studio from The Spectator. Survival for John Major, or does he go ahead now genuinely recharged?
Well, undoubtedly his morale will have improved because of what's happened, even though, as John Sargent said, it was just by 3 votes. But I must go back to this point of the severe trials that are going to face him and the Conservative government in the months ahead. This is not the last, it's the first of a series of potentially very close votes with a lot of heavy whipping, with a lot of agonising pressurising of members of Parliament to try and get government business through. And I think possibly the next really close vote we're going to see will be on the principle of the council tax. There has to be this vote, maybe just before, maybe just after Christmas, on empowering local authorities to raise that money through the council tax and on what we used to call the rate support grant. And it may well be because of the large number of disaffected Tory MPs whose constituents living in more prosperous areas of the country are going to be very hard hit by this, that they will easily find a sufficient number to support an opposition amendment on something like that. And, you know, Mr. Major has had a good night tonight, but he's going to have a lot of other battles like this to fight in the next few months.
Can I ask you very briefly, do you think that, in fact, there will be an agreement thrashed out in Edinburgh which will allow the Danes what they want?
No, I don't, because the Danes effectively want something that's legally binding that's going to involve a change to the treaty, and the Prime Minister has said he won't change the treaty and no one else will. So I don't see how they're going to square that circle at all.
Simon Heffer, Deputy Editor of The Spectator, thank you very much indeed, both to you and to Donald McIntyre for The Independent on Sunday, for being with us tonight. Well, and that concludes this edition of The World Tonight. The main headline: the government has narrowly survived the Commons vote at the end of the Maastricht debate. Its motion inviting MPs to proceed with consideration of the Maastricht Bill was carried by 319 votes to 316, a majority of 3 for the government. Earlier, a Labour amendment seeking to delay further discussion of the bill was defeated by 319 votes to 313, a government majority of 6. Richard Kershaw will be with you tomorrow, but that's it from this edition. From myself, Max Easterman, good night.
Studio production was by Tim Luckhurst. The editor was Gudrun Dalibor. This is Radio 4, now book at bedtime.